what's up, guys? I'm Nick Taylor. I am the co-founder of Found North. I have been blending Found North with my head blender, Sammy, since the inception of Found North. And probably the coolest thing about learning how to blend, because we didn't have formal training, is that it fundamentally changed the way that we actually enjoy and consume whiskey. And I think that's kind of the coolest thing to learn about blending. When we started, we were all working on the sales side of whiskey early on in our careers. And so everything was tasting notes, right? Everything was very tasting note driven, which is very sales driven. The idea of tasting notes is to give the consumer something to latch onto, something to identify with, something that they think they like, and that makes them like the whiskey. And what it does is it really creates a very narrow scope of what the actual drinking experience is when you consume whiskey. And unfortunately, when we started blending, that's how we had learned. That's what our background was. And it didn't work. And what really changed our experience as blenders and made our blends a lot better was actually changing the way that we actually discussed whiskey with each other. Was sort of the forcing function to change the way that we think about whiskey. And the way that is really, the way that presents itself is when you are adjusting a whiskey blend ratio by 2 or 3 percentage points, the vanilla note turns into coconut and the raspberry note turns into strawberry, right? These notes that you were picking up on change, but the overall quality of the whiskey also changes. And if you're latched on to, hey, well, I really wanted that one specific note, well, if you want to fix the overall structure of the whiskey and get it so that it's integrated so that it actually works, you have to kind of start forgetting about the tasting notes. And so when you read about whiskey, when you do a barrel pick, when you do any of these sort of experiences with whiskey, you'll almost always see nose, palate, finish. And it will almost always be a shopping list of whiskey notes, right? Here's the 10 things that your wife told you to go buy at the grocery store, and that's what's in your whiskey. And it's really not an accurate depiction of what the whiskey tasting experience is. And so the way that we started thinking about whiskey that made us capable blenders was we really started to think about whiskey as being a trisensory experience, right? So when you drink whiskey, when you identify any tasting note, that is your olfactory glands, right? That is your sense of smell. We don't actually taste apple, we smell apple while we're drinking whiskey. It's the retronasal effect, right? You can really only taste sweet, sour, bitter, salty, umami. Those things are extremely important to the experience of whiskey. But those individual tasting notes, those actually come from your sense of smell. But the reason that we drink the whiskey, the reason I like to drink the whiskey as an experience is the texture as well, right? The texture really matters. It's the snap, crackle, pop effect that you get across the palate. It's the drying effect on the sides of the palate. It's the blending of the actual different experiences that are all happening over a short but very important piece of time, right? So it's a short time frame. And that evolution, that change of the whiskey over that short period of time really dictates to the experience. So the easiest way to think about it is, we've always thought about it musically. It's an easy analogy. And the reason that we think about it from a music standpoint is music isn't about how many different music notes you can stuff into a song, right? It's the organization of them, it's the richness of the music, it's the time signature, it's all the different things that impact the actual presentation of the song. A blend is the same way. When you taste a whiskey, how you taste it on the landing is actually going to be different than the mid-palate and the finish, right? So this progression is what we're really looking at. And we're looking at the integration of different notes that are almost coupled together with the actual textural experience. So what I mean by this is, like, when something tastes sticky sweet, right? I love that experience with whiskey. When it lands and it's sticky sweet. Sticky sweet to me is both actually the taste and the texture. It's the combination of that gripping sweetness with the actual sweetness itself. And if it has a maple character to it, that's actually your sense of smell. And if that evolves across the palate into more of a creamy note with more fruit and cinnamon sugar, right? What we're actually talking about here is we're not just talking about tasting notes. We're talking about how all three different senses are progressing across the palate. And so when we blend, when we discuss whiskey with each other, we aren't saying, hey, it tastes like list of notes, right? What we actually do is we break it down into 4 quadrants and the resolve. So the first quadrant is the landing. The mid-palate is long enough that we've broken it into a second and a third quadrant, and the finish is the 4th quadrant. Pretty straightforward. But what that allows us to do is say very precisely where something is missing or something is off in the experience. So you might say, hey, there's this whiskey's really lovely in the 1st and 2nd quadrant, and then there's this big gap. All that fruit quality goes away in the 3rd quadrant, and we're really missing it, and it doesn't carry throughout the way we want it to. And then you can go back and you can look at your individual components and say, hey, which one is bringing fruit in the 3rd quadrant? You say, oh, that one is. Let's increase it, right? And so we can get very structural about how we approach whiskey. And the cool thing about that is you don't exactly know where it's going to go, right? You don't set out with a blend and say, I'm going to get golden raisins and Hershey's chocolate. You know what I mean? You're not thinking about it that way. What you're really trying to do is blend in a way where the structure and the narrative of the whiskey is actually altogether evocative. And then you start to tweak the whiskey to fill in the gaps and get the whiskey to really taste integrated. And what I mean by integrated is when you're tasting a whiskey, you don't want it to be bimodal, right? You don't want a whiskey to present one set of characteristics, have kind of this empty space in the middle of it, and then present a completely new, unrelated set of flavors, right? And textures. In the same way that you don't want a whiskey to fall off a cliff or to taste a certain way the whole way and then get really, really dry. You want it to be integrated such that all the flavors are presenting in a really harmonious and pleasant way across the palate. All right, I'm going to pause there and see if we have any questions.
No.
No? Done? Wrap it up. No. No, so I think what's particularly...
I do have.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned 4 quadrants and resolve.
The resolve.
What's the resolve?
You take a sip of whiskey, you swallow the whiskey, you experience the finish, you think the thing is done, it fades, and then there's that echo flavor that comes back and lingers on your palate for the next half hour. That's the resolve, right? It's the after echo that happens once the finish is done. I think with Canadian whiskey, what's really particularly interesting about Canadian whiskey is you don't have to put it in New American oak for its entire lifespan. We actually do put a lot of our whiskey we transfer, we re-rack into New American oak because we love what New American oak does to a whiskey. But the benefit of that is we work with components that are 22, 23 years old, and they've spent 20 years in ex-bourbon, and then they've been transferring it to New American oak. And the benefit of that is you don't get that pencil shaving over oaked quality on the resolve, right? And I don't mean the finish, I really mean the resolve. You taste really old bourbons have a tendency, it's not actually the finish, it's like, oh wow, that finish is lovely. And then while you're sitting there and you're literally exhaling, you're like, oh, there it comes, and it creeps back up into your back of your palate. That's the resolve. That's what we think of when we say the resolve. And that's a, to us, it's funny because we don't actually blend, we don't blend by nose. So, and I think that's because we've taken almost an inverted approach to making whiskey. If you think about how big blending houses have made blends forever, a lot of times they're doing everything by nose, they're watering it down to 20% alcohol, and what they're really doing is they're searching for flaws. They're looking for problems that have occurred during distillation. Because when you were making the exact same whiskey over and over and over again for 40 years, you know what it's going to taste like if you produce it in a certain way. So really what can happen is You can get mold in the grain. You can get introduction of a bacteria you weren't expecting. A barrel could be leaking. Something could be going on that's creating a flaw or a mistake in the whiskey. And so most people who get into the blending process have come up through the quality control process. So the way they've learned is they've learned to nose out mistakes. And when you are blending for the sake of producing a large amount of whiskey the same way over and over again, that actually is the best way to do it. There's no question that that's the way to do it. That's why they do it that way, right? For us, when you're trying to create a unique expression every single time, and you're trying to key in on the minutia of what the really enthusiastic whiskey consumer is looking for, I don't know how you can not drink the thing at cask strength and know what the experience is going to be, because so much of the experience is both textural, but so much of the experience is also the evolution of the whiskey across the palate, right? So if you're not sipping it, if you're not actually tasting it, you're really not capturing what the real experience is going to be.
Okay. Nick, as you're talking about building a blend and working with the different components, what sort of volume do you work with building toward your next release?
10 milliliters. Tiny amounts. Tiny amounts.
Eyedropper.
Yeah.
Not even beaker.
Yeah, we used to use food scales to get really specific, but the problem with food scales is you have to know what the ABV of every component is, right? Because the ABV will affect the density, so it's going to affect the weight. So food scale works, but most of the times, yeah, we're using like tiny little syringes, and we're doing it very, very precisely to fractions of a milliliter, and that's partly because of palate fatigue, right? You get palate fatigue much faster than you get nose fatigue at 20% alcohol by volume.
And at 10 milliliters, using an eyedropper, you're able to swallow, not spit.
Yeah.
And then that gives you the opportunity to really experience
Actually
the
get the
rebound.
experience. Yeah, and we'll do
it. I mean, it's a silly question, but
No,
I always
it makes
wondered, what
sense.
sort of volumes do blenders work with?
And a lot
you're
of
not
times
pouring a barrel and a barrel together.
Yeah, and a lot of times we're fine tuning. A lot of times we're fine tuning later in the process. You can spit the whiskey in the beginning. You can immediately taste it and go, nope, not there yet. What's wrong with this whiskey? But once we're getting to the point where we're doing the last 4 or 5 iterations and we want to get this thing exactly right, we're tasting it.
Okay. As I was with you when we did the first prime barrel exclusive blend through Found North, I was amazed at how many different things we tasted and what a big difference a minute change made if we were looking at the ratios, and I was trying to keep track in my notes. And it really made a huge impact. And I just couldn't imagine how you come about composing that symphony.
Yeah, it's also a huge demand on the processing part of the. It's amazing how much goes into making the whiskey after you get the ratios right. There are a lot of aspects that have a huge impact on the flavor. How it's vatted. Whether you combine the components that you're using before you start blending them, or whether you combine everything at the same time, like there's so much nuance to it. It's actually astounding. It's really fun.
Are you proofing down any of your barrels, or is it
No, it's all at cask strength. So we'll control the entry proof when we're re-racking something. But everything we bottle, we're gonna blend and then bottle at cask strength.
Can we go back to what you said about how they did blends and taste for imperfections? So if they do that, whatever flavor they come up with during blends, there is now like target flavor that they strive for. There's one comment from our hearing. Whatever they come up with, that becomes the profile, and then what goes onto the label, and that's what they sell. Versus what you do you have anything specific in mind before you set out to blend?
Yeah, I mean the really interesting thing about Canadian whiskey is, for the most part, they're doing single grain distillation, right? So it's not 100% of the time. Sometimes you're doing 93% rye, and so sometimes people are doing. Sometimes in Canada they're doing 93% rye and 7% malted barley or something like that. But most of the time, what they're actually doing is 100% corn, 100% rye, 100% wheat, 100% barley. They're fermenting and distilling and aging all of that whiskey separately, right? And what they're actually trying to do is create a wide range of flavors that they can blend with. And what was really interesting learning about this process is like double distilled corn, right? Double distilled corn is not a nuanced whiskey. It doesn't create like a really complex, nuanced whiskey. But what it does create is a layer of flavor, right? And this was something that we learned early on, which was if you take your most complex whiskey and your second most complex whiskey and you combine them together, you don't get good whiskey. That's not a recipe for getting good whiskey, right? Because if you think about all the different flavor and texture levers that you're messing with when you're blending whiskey, if you have something that's moving all of those levers and something else that's moving all of those levers, getting those things into a balanced state is incredibly difficult. Right. Now, if you have something that's very complex and then you have whiskeys that nail a very specific texture or flavor, and they nail it without really impacting all the other flavor levers, they integrate really well into a blend, right? And so what happens is, if you're doing something like marrying bourbon that has all the same mash bill, well, those things have already been effectively set at very similar flavor levers, and they blend really well because they're very similar to each other, right? So when you're taking 100% rye, 100% corn, 100% wheat, 100% barley that are fermented, distilled, and aged separately, put in cask at different proof, and all distilled in different ways, those things are all fundamentally different from each other. And so early on, it was a lot of trial and error to figure out how these types of components would blend well together. After a while, after you've done this enough, you have an instinct of what combinations are going to work. You also start to realize, like, it's like cooking. There are some ingredients that you can use when you're cooking. A pinch of it will really affect the flavor. And other ingredients, you really need a lot of it before it starts to present. Blending's similar, right? Like, you don't need that much rye for rye spice to really show up in a whiskey. If you adjust the rye component from 3 to 4% of the blend, you will immediately notice the impact. If you have two corn components that you're using at 30% and 31% and you switch those, you probably won't notice, right? The small difference there is much less noticeable than the small difference somewhere else.
We're talking about already distilled portion. You're not talking about the mash bill.
No, you're talking about like when we're blending, if we're using 8 components, 2 of them will probably be rye, and 6 of them will be corn or something like that, right? If you adjust those corn ratios, you have to move them more before it really affects the noticeable flavors. You move those rye in terms of their ratio to each other or their ratio to the corn, you're gonna change the flavor dramatically quickly. Right. And so over time, you work with enough components, you test enough iterations, you start to know when you taste the components, hey, I can't use this rye as 30% of this blend. It will completely dominate the blend. I want it at 12%. And you naturally get into a place where you have an instinct as to what's going to happen, or you have just what is instinct? You just have the experience of, hey, I know what's going to happen. And so we have not pre-written formulas, but we get to the point where it's like, let's try what we did. Let's start with what we did at batch 6 and go from there, right? And it's like, what if we started with 87% corn, 12% rye, and 1% malted barley, and we go from there? What will it do with these different components? Okay. And then you start iterating.
Understood. I'm just looking back at some of my notes from that first prime barrel blend. One of them was the 66% rye in the ex-Ruby or ex-Ruby port cask. There was the ex-Calvados cask. Is that the way the Canadian whiskey is barreled when it's distilled, or were those casks you put them in for secondary aging?
That's us. So, I think what's particularly different about Fountain North is, from other Canadian whiskeys is we're bottling everything at cask strength. It's pretty unusual. We use a lot more new wood. We're re-racking so many of the components into new wood. And we use a lot of different interesting finishing casks. And that's just the experimental nature and the desire to find something different, right? We're constantly chasing whatever idea we have down the rabbit hole, right? It's not a, hey, we're trying to get really consistent with how we make this. We want the quality to be consistent, but we want the experience to be varied.
It was all flying at us so quickly. It was really a great and fun day. And I was just looking again, at the different casks. There was the Devil's Cut. There was Muscatel. And it's like, holy cow. And I just never understood whether that was the primary original barrel that the new make went into. Those are all things you're doing. That's phenomenal. I mean, that's a whole nother layer to what you're doing in blending in terms of taking what's coming out of the Great North and putting them in different casks, coming out with different components that you then put into your blends. I mean, what you do is so multifactorial. It's just astounding.
Sort of like I equate it to Lego. Like my son is and that's the world that I live in, right? So essentially what you're doing is you're creating this, you're given these Lego bricks, and then you're building a set. You see different colors, heights, whatever, right? Yeah. Versus like how whiskey is distilled in America, that you use a mash bill, which goes into distillation as a proportion of the mash, but then the blending now becomes a bit different.
I think that the reality is that unless something is in a single barrel, unless something is a single barrel release, right, the whiskey's getting blended, yes, right? Whether you're single malt Scotch, whether you're straight bourbon, and blend for a long time, and this has changed over the last 10 years. But when I started in retail and whiskey, the word blend was like a no-no. You didn't say pejorative, blend. Yeah. It was pejorative. Yeah, that's exactly the word. And what's interesting is the different industries were tripping over themselves to come up with words that didn't say blend but meant blend. Marrying, vatting, mingling, resting. Right? It was like. It was astounding. It was like, how do you think they make the main product of this giant distillery when they're making thousands and thousands of cases every day? You think they're just one barrel? No, of course it's a blend. And most of the job of big distilleries, the master distiller's main job is to blend and make sure that all the products are tasting the way they're supposed to. And they're adjusting for variables that occur naturally all the time. You have a wet year or a dry year, that's going to affect the grain, that's going to affect the yield. What wood you're getting might change. Like, there are all these different factors, and what their job is to take the things that they have rested and blend them so that they're consistent with what people expect the product to taste like, right? The big difference between Canadian and American whiskey, however, is most of the flavor decisions for the whiskey are made in the first 2 weeks in the U.S., right? The mash bill, the char and toasting level, what would you use, where you put it, how long you age it, what's the fill strength, all of these different decisions that you make those are the big flavor decisions. You still have more decisions to make later, but when you get to the blending stage, so much of the product is done, is set. There's not many levers that you can really manipulate. Right. Canadian whiskey is basically the opposite. Right. The flavor decisions are made in the last 2 weeks, and if you behave like we do, where we're taking components that have been aged for 20 some odd years in ex-bourbon, and we're saying, hey, you know what, in 2 years, if we age this for the next 2 years in cognac casks, this could get really interesting. Then we're extending what the sort of period of flavor decision is. But in the end, really what we're trying to do is manipulate components to set the stage for the actual blending.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the key. Like, again, for people that might be watching this, set it differently. In America, you mash everything together, you distill everything together. In Canada, you distill everything separately, and then you start.
Right. And I think what the really interesting takeaway is again, to sort of tie it back to the beginning, what's been interesting for us is the experience of blending has forced us to realize that particular tasting notes sticking out in a whiskey isn't actually necessarily a good thing, right? When you to use the music analogy, when you play a chord or you play multiple notes at the same time, it isn't about those individual notes. It's about the fact of what notes did you choose to play at what time, right? In the same way that when you combine certain flavors that you really love, there's a reason why New American Oak's amazing. It's because it produces vanillins and wood spices, right? Like if you think about, cinnamon and sugar, right? There's a reason why cinnamon's great, sugar's great. But you put cinnamon and sugar together, you get a whole new sound. You get a whole new flavor compound, right? And so as a result, what we started to realize is I think some of our best whiskeys have been our hardest to describe. Because if there was just a word for what a combination of flavors was, that would be easy. But it's being able to say, wow, it's these two flavors with this texture are unique because they're being played at exactly the same time. And then the way that shifts into something else, that's how you start to get a whiskey that is an entire story. Yeah. And when you drink whiskey, a lot of times we want to, as consumers, as whiskey fans, to be able to put our finger on something, right? We want to, why do I like this whiskey? I like this whiskey because I spent a lot of money on this whiskey, right? And I love it, but I can't describe it, right? And so we attach ourselves to specific notes, and it's a natural thing to do, but it starts to really, really narrow the focus of what's good about a whiskey. And that's the beauty of blending is that it's taught us to think about the structure and the whiskey as a whole. And that's what blending is actually about. It's about combining the flavors to create unique combinations that are integrated across a whole in a way that creates its own sound, its own flavor, its own combination of those different senses.
So obviously, whiskey is being blended all over the world, but including America, and we already discussed how the mash bills are different, how it's being distilled. Is it, in your opinion, more difficult to blend Canadian distilled whiskey, where each component is distilled separately, or in America, where it's already been kind of pre-mixed, and now you have that many more factors involved? I
think it's almost like a floor-ceiling thing, right? The rules of American whiskey, especially straight bourbon, are actually very restrictive. It's very precise about a number of things that you have to do to the whiskey to qualify and be in the category. But it's my opinion that those rules have elevated the floor of bourbon. The quality of standard bourbon is very high, in my opinion. And that's great, but it's more about, like, with Canadian, you can explore outside the flavor map, right? If you are restricted to a very specific type of process, this is your flavor map. These are the flavors that you can create, right? This is the combinations of flavors you can create, and you can't live outside of that. With Canadian whiskey, the rules are different so that we get to explore the edges of the map. We don't want to be off the map. The goal isn't to make something that doesn't taste like whiskey. The goal is to still make something that tastes like whiskey. But the opportunity presented by the opening up of flavor opportunity that you get by being allowed to distill to different proofs and different techniques and use different barrel types, it basically allows you to get on the fringe where it's ringing the bell for American whiskey consumers. And I don't mean like Americans, I mean people who consume American whiskey, right? It's ringing that bell, but it's outside of the map of what they're used to. And that's what's really exciting about that. Is that better? I mean, is it inherently better or worse? I don't know. That's hard. I've had some bourbons. I had a bourbon the other day. It was so damn good, it blew my mind. and so there's still incredible heights that you can reach with bourbon, but I think Canadian whiskey is unlimited in where you get to explore.
I understand. I wonder if anybody in America ever did what you guys are doing with Canadian.
Yeah.
There's obviously 100% rye, there's obviously 100% corn, there's obviously 100% wheat, right?
Well, I mean, if you look at the history of Canadian American whiskey, it used to be that, I mean, Seagram's owned 10 American distilleries and 4 Canadian distilleries at its peak and was making blends of both. And they were getting tax breaks if they were using a certain amount of American whiskey. Like there were Americans who were owning Canadian distilleries and Canadians owning American distilleries. So absolutely, historically they were doing it. It's just, it hasn't happened nearly as much over the last 50 years.
I never understood sometimes where Seagram's or Hiram Walker began or finished. Where did they begin and end? And I think that, what they did and even in terms of blending with 72% grain neutral spirits and some of what they were doing mid-century, last century, and just had that negative impact on the thought around blending, as you were talking about earlier. When I think of blending, my brain still goes back there, and Shenley as well.
So I think what's interesting is you cannot use neutral grain spirits in blended Canadian whiskey, but you can in blended American whiskey. And I've almost always thought that, like, is it possible that the bourbon industry loves that because it's really not great for American blended whiskey that you can put 80% neutral grain spirits in it and still call it whiskey. I mean, that sort of defeats the whole purpose, in my opinion, right? It's supposed to be an aged product. Canadian whiskey created the original age mandate. They're the first ones to do it. The Scotch whiskey age mandate was based off of the legislation that the Canadians passed. And so I think the combination of the past integration of Canadian and American whiskey, where it was being owned by the same companies, and they were sending whiskey north and sending whiskey to the U.S., and then these rules around blended American whiskey, Canadian whiskeys got lumped in with it to its detriment. But honestly, at Found North, our job and our perspective is we are not champions of Canadian whiskey. If that's what we end up doing, great. But that's not the point of Found North. The point of Found North isn't to be like, hey, you're missing out on Canadian. The reality is that we love blending Canadian whiskey simply because of the opportunities that it presents us to explore different flavors. And that's really it. And I think that's what's exciting for us, is it just allows us to make great whiskey, and there isn't a preconceived plan or mission behind that. It's just, hey, this lets us make great whiskey, so let's do it.
The individual distillation and aging gives you a broader palate, is what it sounds like. Yes. And then the opportunity to come back after that with a secondary aging and then further build out your components just gives you amazing building blocks.
When we do our high altitude collection whiskeys, we create a blend using components that we've recast. So we take components, we recast those components, we age those components. We then create a blend. We then take that blend and recast it into different finishing casks. Further mature those, and then we pick the best of those casks and we create a secondary blend, and that becomes the final product for high altitude collection, right? So this process goes through a number of iterations over several years before we actually get to the final product. And you just can't do that with any other type of whiskey, really, which is fun, which is why it's really great to make.
You talk about all the different cask finishes. One of the reasons why I like to do a variety of them. What I was thinking, how much of it is you already know what to expect when you choose it versus what's going to happen when you do it? Because I think of like Manzanilla finish. Like a Manzanilla Sherry. Like I had never really had it before. I think, I like the finish. But when I actually tried it, like an actual bottle of Manzanilla Sherry, I was like, it tastes like soy sauce.
Yeah. It's very different than what you expect.
So how much of it do you know in advance, or how much does it just happen?
Yeah. So I mean, this is a great question. It's a maturation question, really, but because of how we blend, it's really important. So when we started doing the high altitude collection, we took some of our inspiration from Scotch distilleries, Scotch distilleries, they design their entire distillation process in a way that's very conducive for certain types of casks. So the easiest way to think about it is like, if you want to age something in a big Spanish oak sherry cask, that's going to have a huge impact on the flavor. You need your distillate to be a certain way to be able to handle that cask type. And so, if a distillery is making a really light style distillate, it's actually probably much more suited to an ex-bourbon cask than a Spanish oak sherry cask. So when we're blending, when we're blending before doing a high altitude collection, before we're going to finish it into a secondary finish, we're thinking about what that finishing cask is going to do, and then we're designing the blend in a way that we think will work well. And one of the reasons that we do a variety of different cask types is because we're anticipating that what we're expecting isn't going to be exactly what we get. And so having a diversity of casks, it means that when we exclude finishing casks from a high altitude collection, it's often not because the cask went bad. It's, man, we were really expecting to get this much spice from these barrels and this much fruit from these barrels, and we got too little spice. And so really what we need to do is we just, to get this final ratio in balance, we're just gonna have to pull 2 of these cognac casks or whatever, right? We have to pull 2 of these very fruit-driven casks out to get the final thing in balance. And that's the challenge for us. It's also the beauty of being an independently owned company. That we don't go in, if we were owned by a bigger company and we went, oh yeah, sorry, we lost 25% of the yield because we screwed up, they'd be like, make it work, right? We get to be incredibly picky about what we use and what makes the final cut, because we're not subject to
Corporate overlords.
Corporate overlords, yeah. No, there you go. No, we're not. Yeah, that's actually right. We're not subject to corporate overlords. Yeah, that's right. No, so I think there is a huge element of trying to shape the spirit before it goes into the finishing cask to make sure that the finishing cask is right. We don't just make a spirit and then guess what the finishing cask is going to be. And what's particularly interesting about that is, like, if you have a cask that is going to do something amazing to the fruit character, you need like a foundation of fruit in your spirit to actually yield that change, right? You don't just get, if there's no fruit present at all if there's no fruit at all in the initial blend before we do a high altitude collection, we tend to yield way less fruit from the further maturation than we expected. Put something into a muscatel cask, you just expect you're going to get a lot of fruit. But if there's no foundation of fruit, you don't always get that fruit. And so it's a lot of times about, like, hey, how do we lay foundation of flavors that we anticipate are going to evolve given certain cask types? And then we're going to try to blend them together to make it fit. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you guys. I'm Nick Taylor, and I appreciate you guys attending the Prime Barrel Academy class.